Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's InfraSight webinar hosted by CPCS. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time to be with us today. This session is being recorded for the benefit of those who are unable to join us live today. So if you're not familiar with CPCS, we advise infrastructure leaders worldwide, such as Transport Canada, Transport for Britain, transportation agencies like Metrolinx, TransLink, and New Jersey Transit on how to better plan, implement, optimize, and deliver infrastructure projects. We specialize in matters impacting the transport and energy sectors, from supporting efforts in decarbonizing transportation modes to improving public transit systems and assisting governments in their transition to clean energy. So to start, just a few housekeeping items before we begin our deep dive. First off, please feel free to drop comments and questions into the chat box. The more, the better. We'll be monitoring the chat box as we go today. Secondly, all participants are muted today, aside from the panel. So we'll take time to try and answer any questions throughout the presentation, but mostly during the panel discussion and the Q&A session at the very end. Lastly, if you need to miss anything or you need to leave the presentation at any time, completely all right. As I mentioned before, this session is being recorded, so we'll be sending out a recording of this session shortly after, so don't worry about that at all. So before I get started, let's go through a round of introductions. So my name is Kitty Chiu, and I'll be moderating the panel discussion today. I'm a principal consultant and mobility planner with CPCS. For more than 12 years now, I've been helping public and private clients see their transportation challenges in a multidisciplinary manner, with mainly a focus on equity and impacts that decisions have on communities. I've worked on mobility pricing files across Canada and the United States, including for Metro Vancouver and California. Now, a little bit more about our panel of speakers. I'm joined today by three speakers: Adrian Lightstone, Steve Allen, and Dan Firth. Adrian Lightstone is Senior Vice President of Advanced Economies at CPCS. Adrian has experience leading multidisciplinary transportation projects relating to regional transportation, mobility pricing, transit, and freight. His background is in feasibility, business cases, financial and economic modeling, policy, and stakeholder engagement. Adrian has worked on several files in North America relating to mobility pricing, including for the Mobility Pricing Independent Commission in Vancouver. Steve Allen is Vice President, UK and Europe at CPCS. He has over 30 years of experience in the transport industry and has worked in several financial and commercial roles. Since CPCS, Steve has worked on major rail projects in Toronto and around the world. Last but not least, Dan Firth joins us from C40 Cities, where he currently serves as the Director for Knowledge, Research, and Major Programs. His role is focused on developing and implementing multi-region projects to advance cities' climate action plans. And he has led strategy, policy, and implementation of major urban planning, transportation, climate action, and innovation projects in multiple global regions. Dan has a track record of implementing complex and politically sensitive projects like traffic restrictions, urban densification, and of course, road usage charges and mobility pricing. So today, our panel will be speaking about the topic of mobility pricing, highlighting the approaches being used by transport agencies globally, as well as examining their potential impacts on the communities that they operate in. So just to kick things off, I'm going to give a quick introduction to the concept of mobility pricing so that we can align a little bit more on some of the common terminology before we turn it over to a panel discussion and an open Q&A. So first off, what exactly is mobility pricing? Well, mobility pricing comes down to a number of different forms and is called a number of different names. But essentially, it all boils down to a set of pricing mechanisms that are applied to mainly the use and access of infrastructure as a means of managing demand for that infrastructure as a constrained resource. It can include things like road pricing, congestion pricing, road usage charges, cordon charges, area licensing schemes, low emission zones, and even high occupancy toll lanes. These concepts certainly aren't new. Toll roads have existed for thousands of years as a way to limit access and help to pay for infrastructure. And Even the more sophisticated mobility pricing schemes, such as cordon zones that involve cameras and sensor detection of movements into and out of an area, or even pay by mileage options like those that use GPS enabled or non GPS enabled odometer tracking technology, have been around for at least the past 1 to 2 decades. So, why are we talking about this now? It's been around for quite some time. Well, based on a lot of the challenges that we are working through with our clients today, we think that mobility pricing is more relevant now than ever. Um, there's a lot that's happening in the transportation space. From an environmental perspective, the climate emergency is more urgent than ever, and there's a growing push towards a transition towards zero emission vehicles like electric vehicles and such. Um, at the same time, both electric vehicles and vehicles more generally are getting bigger and heavier. So, this concept around vehicle bloat, which is leading to other challenges such as increased wear and tear on infrastructure and roadways, and also release of more particulate matter. On the financial side of things, a lot of transit agencies, as many of you probably know, are also facing challenges with funding shortfalls, in part due to the legacy of the pandemic era with decreased ridership and lower fare box revenue. Um, but there has also been ongoing declines in fuel tax revenue as vehicles and technology improvements have made them more fuel efficient. And also, of course, as vehicles begin to electrify and shift towards zero emissions. And lastly, from a socioeconomic perspective, a lot of cities are still continuing to face growing levels of congestion as more people are moving into major metropolitan areas, but even more specifically, as the trend of suburbanization continues to pick up in this post COVID era. This has continued to have an impact on the productivity, a lot of our major metropolitan areas, and also the social well being of those who live in these areas. Travel patterns have definitely changed since the pandemic, but not necessarily in the way that I think a lot of people may have expected during the pandemic. I think at some point, a lot of people thought that the pandemic would lead to a longer legacy of remote work where people would just decrease their overall driving behavior and traffic levels would decrease as it did during the pandemic. But that's definitely not the case today. There continues to be a lot of peak period traffic, but the way that the patterns have emerged have shifted a little bit from what we saw pre-pandemic, with a lot of that traffic now being concentrated in the middle of the week with hybrid work models where a lot of people come in maybe during the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of the week. And in some ways, a lot of this is being exacerbated by people potentially traveling even longer distances to homes that maybe they purchased during the pandemic that were located further away from city centers, and also by continued decrease in transit use. Many of these challenges that I have on the screen right now are very intimately intertwined. And at the center of getting a handle on a lot of these challenges is mobility pricing. There is obvious potential for mobility pricing to be used as a revenue generation tool that could help to address a lot of the challenges around funding shortfalls. But there's also a lot that can be used within mobility pricing in terms of helping to manage this transition to electric vehicles, which is definitely important, especially in the short term, but also comes with some long-term challenges. And of course, in addressing overall congestion. The next slide probably doesn't require very much introduction. I'm sure that if you've worked in the transportation field for a while now, you've seen this quite a lot. Um, and this is really just to show that even though there's really an immediate near-term need for us to encourage transitions to zero emission and electric vehicles, the longer-term reality is that that can't be our only way out of the climate challenges that we are facing today. Definitely, we need to shift in that direction in order to reduce emissions, but the same challenges around um, particulate matter emissions, congestion, and societal impacts around congestion will continue to persist, even if we switch those vehicles to zero emission vehicles or even automated vehicles, which some people think will be able to add capacity to our roadways because they'll drive closer together. At the end of the day, it's all a matter of geometry. And when it comes to focusing on a transition from conventional gas vehicles to zero emission vehicles, they still take up the same amount of space and will have the same impact on our cities. And congestion certainly comes at a cost to everyone. So who should be paying and how much? Well, a quick trip down this Econ 101 graphic would suggest that basically all users who contribute to the cost of congestion have some responsibility to pay. And when we think about a cost of a trip, we know that the cost that a person pays out of pocket for fuel and for electricity and the cost of the vehicle that they are driving contributes to what that cost is for them as an individual. Added to this cost is also the time that each person has to spend within the vehicle while on the road. Under free flow conditions, you don't really have to think about that travel time all that much. However, when we start having more and more vehicles on the road, congestion starts to build and travel times increase. And each additional vehicle on the road adds to this congestion and builds on that additional travel time, both for the individual who's adding to that congestion, but also for all the other individuals who are already on the road through what we consider the marginal private costs. These are costs that drivers already experience and pay for through their time today in the form of time spent in congestion. Beyond this, though, this added congestion also creates added cost burden for the society at large, including loss of productivity, environmental impacts, and wear and tear on infrastructure that are part of a broader marginal social cost. This cost isn't currently paid for anyone, but has brought impacts for everyone within the system. And what mobility pricing really does is it tries to capture this cost burden while dampening the demand by making users pay for this added cost in dollars at this kind of optimal charge equilibrium, rather than in paying through their time spent in congestion. By motivating users to potentially adopt different behaviors, including driving less, driving at different times of day, adopting different modes such as public transit, or foregoing a trip altogether. And while this diagram sums up the concept quite neatly, there are actually many more dimensions to mobility pricing that need to be considered. For one, there are many different typologies of mobility pricing that could be considered, and I touched upon a little bit of that earlier on when we first started. But there's some typologies of mobility pricing that are very much based on the physical characteristics of a city or a road network. For example, if a city has isolated entry points such as bridges or highways where access can be controlled, these are often used as ways to manage access into a city or a specific jurisdiction. There's also others that cover a broader area, such as in the case of a congestion charge or cordon pricing charge in the case of Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Singapore through their electronic road pricing scheme, where motorists are charged as they are entering or exiting an area. And then to a greater extent, the London congestion charge and ultra low emission zone, which charges drivers even for the behavior, driving behavior within the area. And then at the very far end of the spectrum, we are also starting to see mobility pricing schemes that are somewhat independent and divorced from the physical geography of a specific city and cover jurisdictions more comprehensively in more of a true road usage style format. For example, Oregon allows people to opt into the scheme somewhat in lieu of the existing fuel tax, both by providing people with a fuel tax credit in exchange for their participation in the road usage program. Similarly, the California Road Usage Charge pilot is also testing a similar concept as a way to safeguard against declining fuel tax revenues. So conceptually similar, how these various mobility pricing typologies are designed have a lot to do with what the primary objective of that specific scheme is looking to achieve. For example, the Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Singapore congestion charges were mainly focused on managing central business district congestion and the amount of traffic coming in and out, whereas the Oregon and California road usage charge pilot programs are much more concerned currently about the fuel tax revenue replacement. Even though they're conceptually similar, a lot of them have to be very specific to the specific system and context in which they operate. specifically when it comes to geographically based systems like the congestion charge or area licensing schemes. A lot of careful consideration needs to be placed on the boundary effects that could have major impacts on the people who reside within the vicinity and could potentially face the greatest impacts directly on their day-to-day lives. Which brings me to considerations around equity and fairness. These two terms are oftentimes used interchangeably within the discourse around mobility pricing and are often cited as some of the greatest barriers to implementing any type of mobility pricing. But these two terms actually mean very, very different things. So in trying to define these two things, equity is really focused on how evenly are we distributing these costs and benefits to the population. And there's kind of two different types of equity that we need to consider. One is vertical equity. So the distribution of these costs, burdens, and impacts on various income groups. And then there's also the aspect of horizontal equity. So distribution in other dimensions, including things like gender, geography, modes, and transport. There's definitely some overlap here in terms of income impacting where people are located within a specific geographic region, and also cross-sectional impacts between income and these other elements of horizontal equity, but definitely something that needs to be considered throughout all mobility pricing schemes. On the other hand, fairness is a little bit more perception based. Perceptions of fairness are quite individual. Not everyone really agrees on exactly what fairness means or how we can make policy more fair or less fair. But there are definite ways that we can try to address that. And in many ways, fairness comes down to the ability for somebody to actually make reasonable changes to their behavior in order to adapt to some of these challenges that may arise when it comes to implementing a mobility pricing scheme. And a lot of what that boils down to is the potential for redistributing the revenues associated with mobility pricing. And one concept here is on what we call creds. That includes things like caps, rebates, exemptions, discounts, and subsidies, which is one way that we can redistribute revenues to account for some of the potential impacts on equity and fairness. The other, of course, is reinvestment of some of that revenue into mobility improvements that provide new opportunities for people to change their behavior more easily. So if there's a good public transit option, people may not need to drive as much as they needed to without some of that reinvestment. And finally, before I bring it to our panelists, just wanted to bring up this diagram very quickly around public acceptance. Public acceptance is definitely one of the big challenges when it comes to mobility pricing and also many other types of policies as well. And I won't dive too deep into this diagram because I know our panelists have a lot to say on this topic. But when it comes to policies, a lot of times we see this type of curve develop where public support is quite low early on in the process when people don't have a good understanding of the policy. It's a new idea. They don't exactly know what the justification for that policy is yet. But support begins to build when people start to understand what the policy is for, why they need it, what the pros and cons are, and support builds as you get closer to implementation. However, we do often see that as details emerge, people start to see what their impacts are directly to them as individuals, and some of that support might fall off, and people begin to panic just before implementation. But all time and time again, with a lot of these policies, we see that that support continues to build after implementation as people actually have the opportunity to experience that support or experience the benefits of that policy head on. And so with that, I'm going to turn us over to our panel discussion and Q&A. And the first question that I had on my list for our panelists today has a lot to do with public acceptance. And while I'm asking this first question for all of the participants we have today, feel free to add questions into the chat box as we go, and we'll try to address those. But I really wanted to start off with the first question, which is really relevant to what's happening today, which is the New York congestion pricing scheme. So I'm sure a lot of you on the call know that the New York congestion pricing scheme has been put on pause. And given this recent news, I was hoping that we could start off on talking about just generally what your thoughts are on what sets apart a pricing scheme that gets implemented versus those that do not. And since Dan, you're our guest today, maybe I will start with you if you don't mind.
Going straight in with the hardest question. Thank you, and thanks for this intro and for for inviting me to join the discussion. Really timely, great timing there. I think so. I was looking at some of the literature and some of the presentations that I and colleagues were passing around a few years ago. What are the success factors of introducing something like this? And there's a lot of correct but fairly obvious advice, and you've touched on a lot of it. It's being clear about what your aims are, designing it well, thinking really carefully about equity and how you're going to deal with the potential the kind of distortion impacts, having a really solid engagement. And I think, well, I don't think, I know that if you spoke to people at the MTA in New York, they would say we did all of these things. We had all of our ducks in a row. We thought we were there. So I think actually it's yes, it's all of those things. You need to do all of those, but that's not enough on its own. And I think there are two key things. One, and this is what we're really seeing in New York, is timing, and your timing around elections. So when a couple of us on this panel and others I know who are listening were working on the mobility pricing study in Metro Vancouver in Canada, a lot of the time we spent was how do you identify what that window is where all the stars align, where nobody's about to go into an election that they're about to lose. How do you do that? How do you align that with this curve of acceptance that you saw, so that you're not in the middle of this valley of political death, as a former colleague of mine used to call it, just before implementation? You're not going into an election like that. And I think maybe we'll come back to that and talk about New York in a second, because I'm fascinated by that. So one is timing. Be ready to go when the timing is right, but also really think about timing. When is your window when that might be able to work? When are you going to be coming out of that valley of death before you go into an election? The other is something that in Swedish we would call isi magen. So have a little bit of ice in your belly. You need to get through that dip in support. It's going to happen. You're going to have to find a way through it, and it's being a little bit stubborn and a little bit not giving into the voices that will be all around you saying this is too hard, stop it, it's not happening. The panic before implementation. So timing and getting through the panic, having some isi magen, as we'd say in Swedish, ice in your belly.
Thanks, Dan. I wanted to have a follow-up question on that. You talk about having the ice in your belly and being able to, I guess, force your way through kind of that valley of death. Can you comment a little bit more on the pricing schemes that you've been involved in and how you've taken the approach of getting through that?
I mean, I think there's two answers to that. One is the building this coalition of support around you who is not going to abandon you in the middle of that. So if we look, for example, at and it's not strictly a mobility pricing scheme, but what Mayor Sadiq Khan, I beg your pardon, it was Mayor Ken Livingstone who introduced the congestion charge. Mayor Sadiq Khan, who is the current mayor in London, who's expanded what's called the ultra low emission zone. It's about primarily aimed at air quality issues. He's really consciously built all around this policy a kind of real ecosystem of supporters who will back him and will say, yes, we need to do this. Yes, it's hard. And his messaging was really good on this. It's worth looking at. He's like saying, I'm not a natural supporter of these kinds of restrictions, but this problem is urgent and we need to do something about it. So I'm doing this, and I've done all of these other things as well, but we need this too. So it's building that coalition support, and as broad a coalition as you can possibly find. So it's, in London's case, it's particularly the health community and others who the people really respect and will listen to. It's the teachers, it's individuals who have been impacted by poor air quality. And again, Mayor Khan tells a really great story about He himself had adult onset asthma, which is one of the reasons that he's really interested in tackling air quality. So building that kind of coalition of support around you. But then also there's a little bit of just getting the politics right, and I can't really comment. All politics is local, so I'm going to try and avoid commenting too much on exactly what's happening in New York, because I just don't understand the very local politics there, and even the federal politics that it's feeding into. But it's trying to build that kind of political support around you and understanding that politics, so that if you are having to go against people, you know why you're doing it. But also comes back to the things we talked about at the beginning. You need to design the system well, and you need to know that it's going to have the impact that it's going to have, and that it's going to have that impact really quickly. So if I'm saying, trust me, it's going to have an impact on air quality, I need to be able to show that really quickly. I need to be certain that it's going to have that impact on air quality or on congestion, or it's going to raise the revenues, or things are going to work.
Thanks, Dan. Steve, Adrian, anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Dan said. I think a lot of things come down to clear political direction and as Dan said, timing. I mean, one of the reasons why the congestion charging scheme was successful in London is that when Ken Livingstone was standing for election, it was part of his platform that he was going to introduce this. So he didn't need to come and seek any further political authority. He didn't have a referendum that has happened in some cities and are generally lost. People won't generally vote to pay for something that was previously free, or at least they perceived as free. It's not generally a politically winning strategy. So I think it is about that timing and the political will having that clear platform to proceed. And then I haven't heard the phrase of ice in your belly, but the determination to see it through. The motoring lobby is a very vocal lobby, and will oppose any new charges, even if the people who are actually impacted by it are a relatively small proportion of the total population.
And Adrian?
Yeah, I would jump in there to kind of echo what Dan and Stephen said, that politics does play a big role. But I also think that issues like congestion and economic productivity, revenue generation, affordability, they kind of go through the news cycles over the years, and they do come and go, and they come back. And I think while something is maybe not in vogue in terms of thinking about it as a public policy, it's good to kind of keep the planning flame going in the background and really do good planning so that you're ready when, as Dan says, the stars align. Dan and I worked on the Mobility Pricing Independent Commission back in 2017. And at the time that we kicked off the Independent Commission work, the province removed the tolls on the Port Mann and the Golden Ears Bridge during our kickoff meeting, which was a sign, I believe, that it was not meant to succeed at that particular point in time. But it's still, work has progressed in the background. Kitty's done some recent work on it, and there will come a time when it comes back. So I think, having good planning in place, there's no substitute to good planning, and these things take a very long time. They have a very long arc. And, I think that's true for New York as well. It'll come around again.
Dan?
I think just to jump on what Adrian said there, I think you're quite right that nowhere that's introduced it started talking about it less than 20, 30 years before it actually got going. So London's first serious discussion about it, I think, was in the 60s, as early as that, potentially, and a couple of different variations of it came back before it was finally implemented in 2003. Stockholm had discussions, I remember way back in the early 90s, they were talking about it, and it eventually got done in about 2006. New York's in a similar position. I think there's a bit of, you need to march up this hill a few times and back down again before everybody, the discussion is mature enough and there's enough people who have understood it for it to go ahead.
Dan, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to bring our attention to some of the comments that we're seeing in the chat right now, because I think it has a lot to do with the objective of any mobility pricing scheme that we're talking about. We have a few comments in the chat right now that point out that maybe congestion as a focus of the objective is not as easy or desirable as some of these other objectives, and some suggestions around phrasing of congestion pricing as something else, which I think the example of the bridge tolls being removed at a specific point in time kind of point to the, I guess, challenges of focusing so much on one specific objective. I'm curious your thoughts on that, because I know we started this presentation with how there is a convergence of different objectives that are all pointing towards mobility pricing. Is it that important for us to focus on congestion as or any one given objective for a pricing scheme, or should we be trying to incorporate all of these different ideas all at once?
I mean, I think one of the pitfalls of as you're developing a congestion charging, or maybe more broadly a mobility pricing scheme, is maybe trying to do too many things at the same time with the scheme. Picking your objective, I think, is very important. If it's congestion and economic productivity, if it's environmental, if it's revenue generation, it's kind of the old theory that you kind of can't optimize for all things at the same time. You do need to pick one and really focus on that. And then other things will come as kind of secondary effects as a result of that. But yeah, pick something that's very clear and understandable to kind of formulate your charge on.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing as Adrian there. I think part of the success of the London scheme was because it was very clearly targeting congestion, and hence the name of congestion charge. And it was written into the enabling legislation that it had to have that objective. It couldn't be done solely as a revenue raising, but notwithstanding that, the proceeds had to be reinvested in public transport. So I think there's a sort of clarity of message there and a consistency that's important to framing the debate.
I disagree slightly, because it's always more fun if we disagree. I largely agree with you, and I think particularly when you're designing it, knowing what your primary objective is really important. But I think messaging-wise, I think the public is often smarter than we give them credit for, and they can take on board that there are different objectives. But you need to be really careful about how you're talking about it. So in Stockholm, for example, it was officially called, because the two main parties involved in implementing it, congestion tax / environmental charge. I don't know that it made it any harder or easier to implement because it was called that. And I think I'd like to refer to some of the people who are in the chat. And I think I 100% agree. Congestion pricing is a terrible name. It's taking two things that people hate and putting them together and thinking that they'll buy it. At the same time, I think, and I'm working now in the climate change space, and I think we're more guilty of it than anybody else. I think we slightly fool ourselves by thinking that if we just frame this right, then people are going to buy it. They're not going to buy it, because it'll still get called tolls by the newspapers, because that's an easy term that people understand. So yes, think about what you're calling it and how you're framing it, but I think let's not kid ourselves that finding the right name is going to magically make this happen. People are still going to understand what it is that we're trying to do to them. So get it right, but don't obsess about it.
Great, thank you, everyone. I'm going to move on to the next question I had, which was mostly about pitfalls. I know we touched on a lot about the public acceptance aspect of it, kind of the branding aspects of this as well, of mobility pricing as a congestion pricing scheme or whatnot. But there's a lot more different dimensions to implementing any type of mobility pricing scheme. So I'd be curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on some of the other pitfalls that you've seen in the course of implementation. And I'm going to throw that one to Steve to start.
Okay. Well, I think some of the points we've already talked about are relevant here, but also I think having a scheme that is practical for users is important. I mean, one of the criticisms in London when the congestion charge was first introduced was that it seemed to be designed to trip people up and to catch them paying the penalty rather than the charge. And I think there was some justice in that. I think it was almost deliberately anti-motorist in how it was set up, and that changed over time, and it was evolved into features like auto pay, so that you could you could have your number plate recognized when you enter the zone and you'd pay automatically. So some of the punitive nature of the original design was kind of softened. And then I think that helped some of the opposition. I think having, particularly again in the London example, London has a very dense public transport network, so it helps if there really are alternatives, and you can genuinely say that people do not have to drive into the centre of the city. Otherwise, it does feel very much like a tax. And I mean, again, this is touched on earlier in what you were saying, Kitty, but thinking about the boundary effects, there was a lot of concern around, particularly for a sort of zonal scheme, that traffic will get diverted around the boundary, and that is true. That did happen and continues to happen, and that has particular effects for businesses and people who live sort of close to that boundary, and trying to think about how to mitigate that in the design of the scheme, I think, is important.
I would add to that, I had a lot of the same comments here, but one of the pitfalls, and it's less kind of on technical and design of a mobility pricing scheme, but just how it's messaged to the public and how it's implemented that way, is holding a referendum prior to implementing a charge. And even after it's implemented, it can be challenging in terms of like acceptance. And it relates to the curve that Kitty was showing about, how acceptance has, in the early stages, people view it as acceptable because they think it can, do all sorts of things that would be great for the economy and the environment and so on. And the closer and closer it comes to implementation and opening day, people realize, this is actually going to cost me a lot of money out of pocket, and it's going to impact my day-to-day life, and how am I going to afford this, and so on and so forth. And holding a referendum or whatever other kind of means of kind of getting kind of public input prior to implementation, you're going to get negative feedback. And it's only after it gets implemented that people see that it has a whole bunch of knock-on positive effects of being able to be home an hour earlier, to spend time with their kids, or being able to do 2 or 3 more jobs a day if you're a small business owner or a carpenter or a painter or something to that effect. These are all real positive benefits, but they're only viewed kind of after it's been implemented. So yeah.
I think I'd say a thing that I'd agree with everything that's been said so far, but the thing that we didn't get right in Stockholm, or to a certain extent in the discussion around the Mobility Pricing Independent Commission in Vancouver, but I think we got right in London, is putting it in its proper context. So Steve talked about, the mayor went to the mayor in 2000, Ken Livingstone, he went to the polls saying, I'm going to do this, but it was, I'm going to do this as part of this overall transport strategy, and this is how it fits in with that. In Stockholm, it was slightly detached from the overall transport strategy discussion. In Metro Vancouver, by design, this independent commission didn't really have a lot to say about, or wasn't really empowered to say very much about kind of how this fits into the overall transportation strategy, which became a slightly detached discussion. I think you need to put it in that context and say, of course, we're doing other things as well. Of course, we're going to improve your transportation system. Of course, we're going to, invest in cycling and make it easier to walk, and think about security and safety. Once you detach it from that conversation, I think you open up for a lot of quite difficult conversations. I had another one and I've forgotten it now. Oh, it's about the revenues. I think if some systems are very clearly going after revenues, if revenues aren't your primary objective, again, as they were in Stockholm, I think it's very easy to become a little bit tempted or a little bit addicted to the revenues. So some of the changes that have been made in Stockholm in the last few years have not been designed primarily to address congestion issues. They've been exclusively to raise revenues. And then you just get into a really complicated discussion with the public about, the accusation this is just a tax grab. I think the acceptance in Stockholm was built on, you're seeing congestion benefits, you're seeing the city environment feeling better. If you then start to kind of glide into, oh, actually it's about revenues, that conversation, I just think, becomes more complicated.
Just to add to that last point, I think as transport authorities, I guess worldwide, are suffering from fiscal shortfalls following the slowed return to work and hence reduction in fare income, it's very tempting for authorities to kind of look on mobility pricing schemes as a way of supplementing revenues. And the points that Dan makes about care in that regard, I think, are very important.
Everyone, we have a question in the chat relating to kind of the Stockholm experience. The comment says, Stockholm saw what happened in the Edinburgh referendum and opted to do a pilot project before having the referendum. Are there any other examples of cities or regions which did such an approach? So I guess more broadly speaking, the question really speaks to like how important is having a pilot project phase before actually implementing?
I think, and Adrian alluded to it earlier in terms of don't have a referendum before, but probably don't have a referendum afterwards. It was a really big risk and was partly forced by the political compromise that led to it. I could talk for hours about that, so I won't do it. I think that there's the question that I have in my head around that is, what if we'd had this full-scale trial? And you need a full-scale trial. I think doing a little pilot isn't going to work. If you're saying I'm going to reduce congestion, you're not going to reduce a congestion with a pilot with 400 people. You'll test the equipment, but you won't show what the benefits are. So it needs to be a full-scale trial, which means you are spending a lot of money. These things are not cheap to implement if you're going to do it right. They do raise revenue in the long term, but the initial implementation is going to cost you. So I think there's an outstanding question. If the referendum in Stockholm had not approved keeping it, it would have been a huge investment, and what would we have done with that? And I think that's probably the question in the minds of a lot of people in New York right now is, if this thing never happens, we've actually spent quite a lot of money on this equipment, and how can you repurpose that, or do you just need to take it out? But the question to has anybody else done it? I haven't heard of anyone else doing it. I know it's been talked about a lot, and it's driving a lot of the really interesting kind of technology discussion around, is there a much cheaper way of doing this, where you can use mobile phones or you can use GPS equipment that cars already have in order to start charging, and then you're kind of you get over this, what's the initial investment you need to make?
Yeah, I guess other than like Oregon, where they're having more of an opt-in program, or California, where similarly it's that small scale pilot that you kind of warned about just now. Not a lot of other cities have done this kind of broad scale implementation approach to be able to see that full scale.
Well, one of the, I think, interesting things with Stockholm and the pilot was that, as I understand it, the pilot wasn't ready quite in time. And so there was an introduction of the incremental buses and subway service and so on. Everything that you need is kind of the alternative to traveling by car. And that kind of came online 6 or 8 months in advance of the charging scheme actually going in place. So you had these kind of 2 data points of what were the impacts of incremental transit that you needed to kind of accommodate the mode shift. And then you had the data point of what happens when the charge actually comes into effect. And so it wasn't, I don't think it was intended to happen that way, but it did. And so you got to see which had which effect on congestion reduction.
There's a further dimension to that, actually, because so after the congestion pricing trial, it was the congestion charge was switched off for a couple of months, but the transit improvements remained. So you see both what happens if you improve transit without congestion pricing, and there was a certain change, and then congestion pricing introduced, had a much bigger change. Congestion pricing was switched off, but the transit remained, and that had another level of kind of impact. So it's a really interesting natural experiment, because it wasn't intended to be that way. I think it was the procurement was appealed, if I remember, and that was the reason that the start was delayed.
Dale in our chat is kind of reading my mind, and one of the questions I had was a follow-up to what Steve had mentioned about the success of London, and in some ways, Dan, what you just mentioned now about the transit improvements in Stockholm. And I was wanting to ask, I think the success of a lot of these systems that have actually been implemented has been built on transit systems that were already quite effective to begin with. And in the case of Vancouver and the mobility pricing scheme, a lot of the challenge was that there is good transit, but the question is how much transit is needed in order to make this happen. There's a bit of a chicken and egg question there. And the question that Dale posed to us is whether there's a sweet spot on where you need the revenue to be in order to build that rapid transit to begin with, or have enough of that transit to start.
Hard question.
Very hard question. Maybe I can start by saying that at least based on some of the research that we've been doing in a lot of the jurisdiction scans, there's at least one example, Singapore, that actually didn't start with transit that was all that great. As I recall from our research, the area licensing scheme that came in the 70s, when it was a little bit more of a manual approach, came in around the same time as some of these bus improvements. And so a lot of it kind of happened simultaneously, and not so much that there was already this advanced mass rapid transit system in place in order to facilitate that. The two things kind of grew together hand in hand. It wasn't so much a package deal where they were put together, but it was done simultaneously with the intention of providing that as an option. I don't know if Stockholm and London had. Is that good?
It depends a lot on what you're trying to achieve, I think. If your objective is all about congestion, then yes, you need something that people can do instead. Typically about, and in the systems I've been involved in, or the surveys I've seen, or even some of the modeling I've seen, you see about half of the people who stop driving. It's more complicated than this because people change behavior on different days. But at a very basic level, about half the people who stop driving will show up in the transit system. The rest will do other things. They will combine trips. They'll go somewhere else. They'll change the time of day they travel. All kinds of different adaptations that people make. So you probably need to be able to accommodate them in your transit system so it doesn't get overwhelmed. That's the kind of basic, very transportation nerdy side of it. I think there's the things you need to do in order to get acceptance and to make people think that this is okay to do. And then there are some people, and I guess we'll get onto questions about equity later, but there are some people who genuinely don't have an alternative and are on very low incomes, and you need to help them in some way, and improving transit to particular locations might be a really crucial part of that. But I think none of the cities that have introduced it so far have done it on the back of a very big new transit investment. They've done it by investing in buses and improving the reliability of buses and putting in bus lanes very successfully in some cases. I think the example to watch right now is Auckland. Seems to be the city that, unless again something politically happens between now and implementation, is the one that's closest to doing something, after New York, unfortunately. They are very deliberately kind of putting it together with we're opening a new commuter rail tunnel through the center of the city. Let's put it on the back of that. But again, it'd be interesting to talk to someone from Auckland about how much that is to do with that providing lots of extra capacity, or that being this is a really good symbolic time to show that we're definitely investing in transit at the same time as we're doing something that's going to be perceived as making it harder to drive.
I think just to touch on your point there, but equity, Dan. So yeah, I mean, like it's obviously a big issue as it relates to congestion mobility pricing schemes of any kind, and kind of needs to be understood during the planning phases. And when we talk about transportation equity, it's usually a measure of how accessibility is made better or worse off, either in terms of transport options that are available. So in this case, the alternatives, or the out-of-pocket costs that people face, or both. And so Kitty kind of alluded to this, but the caps, rebates, exemptions, discounts, and subsidies. Once you understand who the vulnerable groups are and what makes them vulnerable, like as an example, you're a low-income shift worker and you just cannot change your time of day of your travel and so on. Being able to kind of put in place measures that alleviate some of the kind of equity issues is important. It's also possible to get into kind of an analysis paralysis, going down the whole trying to understand how to make everybody okay, or make everything equitable. It's just not really possible at a planning phase to do that. And you do kind of your best attempt in advance of implementing, and then you tweak afterwards. Like every single scheme that is in place right now has gone through multiple iterations of either technology or pricing schemes or time of day and so on and so forth. So it is possible to iterate on a charge after it's been implemented.
that kind of brings me to the next question that I had, which was that travel behavior and how people respond to schemes like mobility pricing is really hard to predict, even if we have the most sophisticated mobility and transportation demand models out there. And Adrian, I think you alluded to this a little bit already, but how important is it to get the design of any mobility pricing scheme correct on day one? And is there any room for trial and error or adjustment over time? And maybe Dan, if you'd like to start with that.
I think from a nerdy transportation economics or planning perspective, the great thing about pricing is that you can adjust it and tweak some of the rules and the times and the numbers until you get the result you want. I think the reality is, if you're a politician who is staking your reputation and probably your job on getting this right and saying, I'm going to do this, it's going to solve traffic congestion or air quality or whatever it is you want to do, you better make damn sure it's going to do that on day one. And if it doesn't, you can't say, oh, give me a couple of weeks because I'm going to adjust the numbers up and down and we'll get there. It's not going to fly, unfortunately. So I think it comes back slightly to depending on what it is that you want to get out of it. If revenues are your main thing and you're not looking to influence travel behavior for whatever reason, then probably you can do that. If what you're saying is, trust me, I'm doing this because we're going to solve congestion, you need to be showing, that needs to be obvious to people that you've done what you said you were going to, I think, from a political perspective. But yes, there is absolutely scope to adjust things.
Steve, Adrian, anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, not really.
I think what I said before, which was that I think things can be adjusted after the fact, and many of these schemes have gone through many iterations, and it's possible to adjust afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's interesting to contrast with, if you build a highway and say, I'm going to solve congestion, it doesn't, then you're stuck with a highway and there's not much you can do about it. You might have built it in the wrong place. If you do this with pricing, it is very adjustable. So I think making that contrast is quite useful. Yeah. Equally, if you build a metro line and you build the metro line in the wrong place and it's not having the impact you wanted, it probably will over time, but initially maybe won't. It's, again, making that contrast in the, if this doesn't quite work, then I can adjust it. And to Adrian's point earlier, being able to adjust things until you get the equity or the distributional impact of this right, I think is really useful. But also responding to things like, let's hope we don't have another pandemic, but if a pandemic comes, then you do have the ability to, as long as you're not completely dependent on the revenues, to adjust up and down in the way that Singapore does on a very dynamic basis.
Then I'm curious. Sorry, guys.
Sorry, Kitty. I was just going to say how you measure the success of your scheme is probably quite important as well. So obviously, if your focus is reducing congestion, there are many things that influence congestion. So, I mean, again, in London, the congestion charging scheme was very successful when it was implemented in terms of reducing congestion. And then congestion started to rise again for a number of reasons. One is background economic activity, reduction in road space because road space was taken out for cycle priority and for bus priority. And hence there was criticism that the effects had sort of worn off after that early implementation. So being clear on what your measures are and what other things can influence them is kind of important too.
I want to touch on, Dan, something that you mentioned earlier about the difference between more of a fixed infrastructure, like investing in a highway, versus, say, implementing a pricing scheme. Because it's not necessarily true that there's no physical investment in a mobility pricing scheme. For example, a lot of the cordon charges and area licensing charges have the physical gantries like the ones that New York has right now installed already. So I'm curious to ask, there are technologies in place today for road usage charges, like the ones that Oregon and California are testing today. Why are we not already thinking about those types of charges, and why are we still so focused on congestion pricing in this cordon form? And maybe this might have a little bit to do with what Fergal's asking in the chat as well, whether or not this type of shift toward that fuel tax replacement is inevitable
I think it's a really good question. I think part of it's down to not wanting to overcomplicate this. I think there's a simplicity argument to this kind of central cordon thing, and I think it might be misplaced. And I think I can absolutely see the reasons to there's all kinds of really good reasons to want to get to something much more sophisticated, the kind of per mile or per kilometer charge that varies by time of day and is, you know, infinitely adjustable. I think is clearly a very attractive thing. But I think at the same time, the simplicity of a cordon speaks to a lot of people, and I think maybe makes it easier to sell. But we've never really tried to sell a kind of urban road usage charging system that is kilometer based, so it's hard to say whether that's true or not. I think if you'd asked me this 10 years ago, I'd have said people are probably really concerned about the privacy. I don't think that's true anymore. I think we're all used to having GPS in our mobile phones and they're listening to us all the time, so I don't think that's as big a concern as maybe it would have been. But I'd be really keen to hear what everybody else thinks, because I'm not certain what is stopping us doing that.
I was going to say the same. I think simplicity, ease of understanding for people. I was going to say privacy as a concern, maybe in some jurisdictions more than others. But I think that those are, to me, a couple of the answers.
I think the privacy one is interesting because people are quite happy to give up their data to a private telephone company and seem much more concerned about giving it up to a transit authority. And also, I think, and perhaps linked to that, there's part of the sort of trust in politicians and public authorities is a problem here. So, you know, I think there's a very good argument as to why a sort of wide-based road user, you know, distance-based charging scheme should be implemented to replace fuel taxes, and you could design something that was ultimately revenue neutral. But I'm just not sure there's the trust out there that it would ultimately be revenue neutral, and I think that's what lies behind some of the lack of acceptance.
I think that's true. Also, privacy, I think, is really local. So again, an observation in London, there is CCTV everywhere. You are recorded every second of your move of anything you do. But getting access to license plate data and connecting that to a person is really strictly controlled. So I remember when I was at Transport for London, you know, the number of people who had access to that data were a tiny minority. It was really strictly controlled. In Stockholm, by comparison, it's quite difficult to get permission to film and use cameras. You need permission from a court. You need the county authorities. The government basically needs to approve everything. There's very little CCTV. But I can go on a website now and I can look up somebody's license plate and work out where their address is and whether their car's insured or not. So what we consider to be private or not varies much more than you would think, you know, even between Sweden and the UK, which are relatively similar countries, relatively close to each other.
I think that touches on a point about the cultural side of things are important. So, you know, it's easy to make comparisons between Singapore and New York, but the cultural factors behind such schemes are things you kind of have to bear in mind.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, that leads me to one of the last questions that I had seen in the chat that I've been holding off on a little bit. And it was a question on whether there is a model for mobility pricing in African cities, especially cities like Lagos. You mentioned that culture is a big component of it. Can you speak a little bit more about what that culture is? What is the secret ingredient here?
Well, I'm not sure I would be the best place to, particularly on Lagos, but I mean, we hear a lot about Singapore and particularly in political discussions in the UK about the sort of economic model of Singapore and the idea that you can just transfer things that work in Singapore and they'll work in other cities, I think is a kind of big mistake. You know, obviously there are things about we've talked about privacy and attitudes to privacy and compliance to rules that sort of vary from city to city. So I think just thinking about, or as Dan was saying, everything is local ultimately. So you do need to think quite hard about the local context before as you design and implement such schemes.
So I should maybe bring a C40 perspective, though. We have a large number of cities who are C40 member cities in Africa, and a number of them have some form of congestion pricing within their climate action plans. I'm not going to necessarily name and shame. Shame is the wrong word. I'm not going to name them in this meeting, but certainly there are cities that are looking at it really carefully in every geography, because traffic congestion is an issue in every geography.
Dan, does that differ from some of the mobility pricing schemes that we see in other parts of the world? Or like, is the discourse different?
I mean, it's again, to Steve's point, all politics is local, and therefore the discussion that is being had in South Africa is very different from the one in Nigeria, and the one in Cape Town is very different from the one in Johannesburg. So it's I think there's always a local flavor to this, but the kind of at the core, the discussions are recognizable from the ones we had in London and the ones we had in Stockholm and the ones we had in Vancouver and the ones they're having right now in New York. So it's, yes, there's a local flavor to it, but it's at its base relatively similar. And I think that we do a lot of work on transport in African cities, and I think there's a really interesting this concept of leapfrogging, that can we help African cities to avoid some of the big mistakes that European and North American cities made. For some of them it's too late. South Africa, for example, is a very car oriented society in a way that other cities in the region aren't necessarily. But I think there's still potential in some countries to make those kinds of changes. I was reading the other day that Ethiopia, I think it is, has banned the import of non-electric vehicles, which I think makes them the first country in the world to achieve 100% zero emission vehicle sales, which is amazing. And it's there's lots of very different aspects to that, and I'm sure a lot of it is about helping local manufacturers, but I think it's still a really interesting thing to be keeping our eye on. There's a lot of really interesting work coming out of Africa that we should all be keeping our eye on. It's easy to get obsessed in our business with what's happening in Europe, but I'd encourage you to look at every part of the world, because there's really interesting innovation happening everywhere.
That's great. And it sounds like a lot of the people in the chat want us to continue some of this discussion after the fact, after this session. And so we'll try to think of new opportunities for us to connect more broadly as kind of a community that's focused on these types of topics. But we are a little bit over time now, so I'm going to try and wrap us up for now. I want to say thanks again to, of course, our panelists, Dan, Steve, and Adrian, for joining me today to talk about mobility pricing. And of course, thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us and taking time out of your day to join the discussion. As I mentioned earlier, this session is recorded, so as soon as we get the recording finalized, we'll send it out to you all, and hope to see you again at a future InfraSight session. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.